So let's talk about an interesting little mini expansion for Warhammer 40k, with the option to swap out some core stratagems for a new set, and some of them look fairly wild with things like 24-inch range melter guns, charging out of sequence, or massive great big cavalry moves. Let's take a look at what we've got. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking about a mini expansion for Warhammer 40k. This one was definitely one I was interested in taking a look at when Games Workshop announced it in White Dwarf. Basically the idea being an expansion set for Warhammer 40k that swaps out core stratagems, and interestingly compared with a bunch of the other content that they've done in the past, it's not just earmarked to be in one system of the game like Crusade, so I was interested to see what sort of format it would take and their advice for playing with it. The rules for this one have been published in White Dwarf 510. It sounds like this could be the first in a sort of mini expansion alternative ways to play series that they're doing. The series is called Aspects of War. Apparently the format of this is that it's not necessarily just locked to Crusade play or anything like that, like some of the other White Dwarf rules that they've had in the past, but instead could be an optional extra to play in sort of any regular casual game of Warhammer 40k, encompassing a whole bunch of different missions, and they mentioned that you could use it in your Crusade games or match play games if you'd want to. It's not going to be something that's recommended for maybe the most official levels of tournament play, but more sort of a different twist that you can put on the rules if both you and your opponent agree to it, and you want a different sort of tactical challenge for armies being put on the tabletop. It means it's not going to be used for competitive play or anything like that. It's maybe going to be better for either small tightly knit gaming groups who want to try it out, or maybe people you know more as opposed to random pickup games. As it'd be interesting to see what else they come out with this series. It looks like the first one here is called Strategic Supremacy. And while it only takes up 3 pages worth of White Dwarf, using the rules would be a pretty massively different experience to playing Warhammer 40k in general, because it basically swaps out all of your core stratagems, gives you a different resource to manage, and gives you another 10 stratagems to play with instead. Basically, if you use this rule set, the idea is that you'd use just one of these aspects of war scenarios as an additional layered on rule set to a game that you've already got rules for, like a Crusade mission or a matched play mission. And so far the only aspect of war choice that we have at the moment is this Strategic Supremacy expansion. And if you use this one, the idea is that you have a bonus set of Exigency command points, and these ones can be spent on unique stratagems which replace the core stratagems of 40k, so there's no Overwatch, no tank shock or command point reroll or anything like that. And then there's 2 additional rules on top of that. There's a sort of catch-up mechanic that can both hand out more command points and more exigency command points to the player with fewer victory points at the start of a battle round. And finally there's also a rule that allows you to put more forces into strategic reserve than you'd normally be allowed to. Focusing on those exigent command points first. Firstly, giving it a Google, exigence apparently means an urgent need or demand, and the idea is that you basically have 2 command point trackers, one for regular command points and one for exigent command points or ECP. So you basically have 2 different resources to manage, so a tiny bit more bookkeeping there. As mentioned, for regular command points you can't spend them on the normal Warhammer 40k core stratagems, but you can still use them on any detachment stratagems. Say for example if you had a Space Marine detachment, then you could still use it on Armour of Contempt and the rest that you'd get from that, and any mission stratagems such as say the one for swapping out tactical objectives from Pariah Nexus missions. Then, as mentioned, there's 10 exigency stratagems that basically come in place of the core stratagems, and when you pay for the command point cost of these, you can either use regular command points or exigency command points, or any mix of the 2. It basically means that regular command points do have more value than the exigent ones, as the exigent command points are locked to being spent on this set of stratagems only, whereas the command points you can spend on these or other things. It seems that the exigency stratagems often have some slightly higher costs to reflect this, but not really massively so, given that the ECP that you'd be gaining will be happening completely on top of the regular command point generation. Finally, for generating command points, as mentioned, there's an underdog bonus from Battle Round 2 onwards at the start of the battle round. If one player is trailing their opponent by 5 victory points or more, then they gain 1 ECP. And then if they're behind by a long way and they have 15 or more fewer victory points, then they also gain 1 command point as well. So potentially say if you're trailing the opponent by 16 victory points or more, you both gain an extra command point and an extra exigence command point. So quite a lot of extra resources to get swings in the game there. I feel like this one's a fairly nice idea in theory, but on the other hand there's definitely armies out there that might not score so much in the first couple of battle rounds and might pick things up towards the end of the game just naturally. Maybe armies looking to table their opponents for example, and that means that they might often get the underdog bonus to start with even if they were on track to absolutely dominate the game anyway. In general though, I do like the idea of this one. It does maybe help a player catch up a little bit if they've got really quite a long way behind. Before we get on to the exact nature of those stratagems, the last part of the core rules is an increase in the strategic reserves limit. Usually in 10th edition, if you're using strategic reserves as opposed to deep strikes and things, you can typically only put up to a quarter of your points in strategic reserve, but it looks like for this one you can put up to half your points, so 500 points in incursion or 1000 points in strike force for example. I don't know if the idea of this one is to try and create somewhat more of an escalating conflict if players decide to use it, and maybe make the last few rounds really matter. I guess it means that you can hold some more big threats and reserves to hit the enemy hard round 2 or 3 if that makes most sense though. Before we get into the stratagems themselves, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor in Weyland-Yutani terrain. They're one option if you want to get some functional competitive style 40k terrain on the tabletop. There's lots of good terrain sets out there. They're certainly aiming to cater to the more tournament-focused side of the market, basically being the official suppliers of the WTC, the biggest and best-known Warhammer 40k team tournament in the world. Their ruin terrain is made of sturdy plastic art which can be set up and taken down, so it's able to be stored flat, and you can get it in a bunch of different designs as you can see here. And then they've got a few full table 40k terrain sets. This WTC War Master Pack I think has quite a good mix, a few big ruins, a few small ones and some armoured containers. They've got a Pariah Nexus themed one for the WTC layout of this 40k season, this one going a bit heavier on the really big ruins. And then just have some smaller sets for just getting a few big line of sight blockers on the tabletop, like this 4 3-story ruin one, maybe handy enough just to make sure that at least some of the table is well blocked from line of sight even to big models. In any case, there'll be links down in the video description if you want to check them out, and there's a code Auspex5 for 5% off if you did want to pick something up for them. Thanks to them for sponsoring this video in any case. Getting on to those Exigency Stratagems though, and as mentioned there's 10 of them. A fair few of them are 2 CP or 2 ECP. You can mix and match your resources, though given that you're gaining both a command point and an Exigence command point, even the big and spendy ones of these will be in reach. First up, there's 2 CP for one called Victory or Death. This one's a Fights on Death one for your models, declared when you're targeted in the fight phase. So basically these ones generally tend to be quite good if you've got a scary melee unit that's just been charged by an enemy one and is about to get wiped out. Quite a few detachments do have these. They're quite good sort of counter melee stratagems, quite handy if you've got something scary in melee yourself. It maybe does feel like the sort of one that could be a core stratagem if Games Workshop wanted to redo them in some way. Maybe with a feel not so very different to things like the counter-offensive stratagem. Definitely a potentially big value one there to take a chunk out of a scary enemy unit that's killing yours. Next up, and maybe one of the craziest ones here, is the Hammer Blow. This one's 2 CP for a massively big hitting damage dealer one. You can use it either in the shooting phase or fight phase. You get a big +1 to hit and +1 to wound, and on top of that you ignore modification to AP or damage of your attacks. So it basically counter things like say Armour of Contempt, or things like the Redemptor Dreadnought's damage rule where it drops the characteristic by 1 or half damage sort of models like Catan. This one is a big 2 command point investment, but the amount of damage that you could get from this is really quite brutal, particularly given that it's just completely unrestricted and you can use it on any unit in the game. You could put it on a great big Titanic class unit like say a Baneblade or a Knight Castellan or something like that, and there's no restriction on splitting fire as well, so you could use it to hit a bunch of things in the enemy army. As well as that, it just seems like quite a good one to use if you're really trying to deal maximal damage to one big central enemy unit, particularly if they've got defensive special rules that could be countered by this stratagem. Overall it certainly looks rather murderous. Next up, for 1 command point, there's Break the Line. This one's targeted to a mounted or beast unit, and you get to add 2d6 inches to their move characteristic when they make a normal move in your movement phase. As well as that, you can have the units move through enemy models, besides monsters and vehicles. I do feel like maybe mounted models come off a little bit second best in the core book stratagems. There's not as much dedicated to them as there are to other units out there. Kind of nice to give them something. This one does mean that they can make just ridiculously long charges though. Say if you have a 12-inch moving bike or cavalry unit, then with fairly average dice between this and charging, you'd have around about a 26-inch average charge threat range. Certainly the potential to charge all the way from one deployment zone to the next in one turn flat. Never mind if you've got any other boosts that could get them there even faster. If you're a bit closer to the enemy as well, it could be a good way to jump over screening units too and get at the things behind them. Certainly feels like one that's going to be a lot more applicable to certain armies than others, but for just 1 command point, an extra 7-inch movement on average is pretty crazy, particularly given that you can still charge after and still shoot to full effect. Next up, for 1 CP, there's Crushing Advance. Titanic units add an extra plus d6 inches to their move characteristic in the movement phase. They're allowed to move through enemy models this turn besides Titanic ones, so you can go stepping over monsters and vehicles and things like that. And then after you've moved, 1 enemy unit that's been moved over, you get to roll 6d6 for, and you'd get 1 mortal wound on them per roll of 3+ that you rolled. So on average rolling, that's around about 4 mortal wounds or so. I feel like that's at least a fairly good trade-off for 1 command point or Exigence command point to start with. And I believe per the 40k movement rules at the moment, you are allowed just to move up to something and then back from it. So you could basically just use this as a sort of Thunderstomp style rule if your Knight or Baneblade or something was fairly close to the enemy and you just wanted to deal some mortal wounds up close. Feels a little bit more niche than some though, given that not every faction goes out to play with super heavies. Next up for 1 command point, there's Targeted Demolition. This one's a slightly unusual terrain focused one, where if you have one monster or vehicle within 2 inches of an area terrain feature, they can try and clear it out a bit. Enemy units that are at least partly within that terrain feature take 1 mortal wound on a roll of 6+ for each model in there, going up to a 5+ if your unit has a toughness 10 or more, and it's capped at a maximum of 6 mortal wounds for each unit. I guess the upshot is you sort of ram a piece of terrain and cause some damage. It could be fairly scary if it affects maybe a massive area terrain piece if you have one on the board, or could be a reason for the opponent not to want to castle up with all their valuable infantry hiding out of line of sight in one singular ruin. Feels like this definitely would be best on a toughness 10 or higher model though, as you're basically getting double the value out of that compared with regularly. Maybe this is in some way in exchange for tank shock, which wouldn't be possible in this detachment. For 2 command points, there's one called Inescapable Augury. Again, this one's pricier, but it means that you can get a bit of close range indirect fire if needed. The unit that you use it just simply gets indirect fire on all of its weapons, but the range is capped at 12 inches, and you can't combine it with the next stratagem called Enhanced Ammo. It basically means that in this game mode, you can't be 100% sure that even if you've hidden your units out of line of sight in the midboard, that they'd be completely immune from damage. If your opponent can get at least somewhat close to it with a shooting threat on the other side of a ruin, they could potentially hit it quite hard, and this could be pretty nasty to say maybe a melee unit that's being staged out of line of sight in the midboard, and then a shooting unit rocks up to shoot them hard. You could maybe have something like a Rogue or Dawn tank suddenly hit that enemy unit with a serious amount of firepower, even if it does take the usual debuffs like not hitting on better than a 4+ and being -1 to hit as well. Being able to threaten this would definitely make you think twice about how you hide units, and for the opponent whether or not the spend is going to be worth being able to hit something that otherwise would be completely safe. Next up, for just 1 command point, there's one called Enhanced Ammunition. This one's a shooting one that gives you plus 12 inch range to your weapons in your shooting phase, so it goes down to just plus 6 inch range for torrent weapons. That's quite a nice quality of life one to have for shooting, meaning that if you're just annoyingly out of range of a key target, then it's going to be an option to make sure that the damage actually goes where it needs to be. Planning to carefully outrange the opponent in this game mode just isn't really going to work so much. But in particular, this one's going to have outsized value for anything that's got really quite a short range normally. So say 12 inch range melter guns feel like the most obvious thing. For 1 command point, you could have things like Tower Fusion Blasters being within melter range directly after deep striking onto the board and setting up just outside of 9 inches. So that'd be pretty brutal stuff for dealing with enemy tanks with units like that. Definitely feels like a useful one for just 1 command point. Shooting definitely doesn't have it all its own way though. As for 1 command point, there's Valorous Charge. This one gives you a 3d6 inch charge roll, and you can nominate units as a charge target from up to 18 inches away. So it does mean that while shooting units might be able to engage a bit further and fire at things out of line of sight when they're in close, important melee units making charges are going to have that bit more threat. With average rolling, that's around about a 10 inch charge, though it can certainly swing high or low. And this one would give you an odds-on charge straight out of deep strike, which is pretty big. Though I would bear in mind that in this version you're not able to command point reroll, and you wouldn't have access to rapid ingress as well, which is another way of potentially getting very reliable charges, even if you have to delay gratification by a turn. Still, having that much of an increase on the charge threat range is pretty massive, particularly as that could combo with, say, detachment things that allow advance and charge. Pretty scary stuff for melee armies out there. It seems that there's just quite a lot that can allow melee or shooting to hit each other even harder in this. For 2 command points, there's one called Hit the Deck. You declare this at the start of the opponent's shooting phase, and an infantry, beast or swarm unit can't be shot outside of 18 inches, and that unit also gains stealth as well if you happen to be within. You declare this after your opponent's moved all their units, so you could know perfectly which units would be able to shoot the thing and which would not. You're not able to declare it reactively though, as you need to do it at the start of the shooting phase, so before the opponent's fired anything. This one's at least fairly common to a bunch of different detachments out there. That could be fairly nasty given that you've got some big threatening units that you could use that on. So if the opponent really needed to destroy some Terminators but wasn't quite that close, then turning off damage output to them could be huge. It does cost a big 2 command points, but again that's still going to be very much in reach given that you generate a command point and an Exigence command point each turn, never mind any further that you gain from elsewhere or potentially with that catch-up mechanic. Finally, for 2 command points, there's one called Interception. This one's another really powerful melee one, and this one's basically a heroic intervention but on steroids. Rather than having any restrictions, it's just one of your units can declare a charge at the end of the opponent's charge phase, though you don't get the charge bonus this turn, so units will just be fighting in their normal order. It does mean that if the opponent doesn't have fights first though, then there's a good chance your unit could be swinging first by the natural order of combat. At 2 command points it's pretty pricey, and without a way to command point reroll it, it's going to be at least somewhat unreliable. But still, this could be one that's just absolutely game-changing. Even with just the threat of it, you'd be tempted to keep units well away from enemy melee units just in the first place. There'd be less scope for just moving up cheap units to contest objectives without having them wind up in close combat. And for any army with scary melee, it'd be an opportunity to gain an additional fight phase and potentially kill some more things out of sequence. And that could very, very easily be worth 2 command points, never mind the extra movement that they might get. Again, it's fairly pricey, but an absolutely massive thing if it came up in the right situation. In any case, those are the 10 stratagems. It certainly looks like an interesting way to shake up a game of Warhammer 40k, and I feel like they're interesting enough to use as a bit of variation. If you do feel that 40k is maybe getting a little bit samey, it will kind of depend on whether or not you really feel that's the case though. I feel like a lot of people don't play 40k to this sort of regularity where that really happens, particularly with Games Workshop's frequent updates. I think changing the core stratagems is really quite interesting on paper, though if you're just trying to try them out for a game, I feel like that would take a fair bit of mental load and learning. Quite a lot of the core stratagems in 40k, like Overwatch and command point rerolls and things, they all feel fairly instinctive to how 10th edition is played, and you just be kind of used to having your units being able to use those options in game. You definitely have to think about things very differently if they can't. Losing the command point reroll I think is maybe one of the less good ideas of this one. I think that's quite nice just for toning down the swinginess of 40k a little bit, and just having something to ward off against the excesses of bad luck. In general, I feel like that's quite a nice bit of game design in Warhammer 40k in general. It might have some weird implications for certain units as well, say for example the grenade keyword not meaning much on many of the squads, and I guess might incentivise certain units more. I guess cavalry and beast units definitely get a big bonus with a casual 1 command point for an extra 7-inch extra move or so. For the stratagems themselves, it feels like a fair few of these might make Warhammer 40k just a fair bit more of a dangerous game. Quite a few of these just seem to be able to get damage to where it needs to be and hit extra hard, whether it's melee or shooting. The extra range one means that guns will be able to find their targets easier, as would the indirect fire. The boosted charge distance on a 3d6 means that melee units could get where they need to go a lot easier. The charge out of sequence one feels kind of massive, and again could be a massive source of extra damage if you don't carefully play around it and pull your units back from the scary stuff. And perhaps in particular that massive hitting +1 to hit and wound. That looks like a fairly monstrous damage boost that you can put on your biggest, scariest unit, provided it's a good recipient for it. My guess is with a bunch of these power moves it'd probably be a fair bit less balanced than current Warhammer 40k. Maybe just having an excess of massive power moves that you can do with those big stratagems combined with your scariest units is likely to yield some massive results one way or the other. But I guess that might not be the worst thing in the world for more casual games. In any case though, I'd be interested to what you make of the mini expansion down in the comments below. Would you be tempted to give these rules a try for a casual game or two or not? I'll leave this one there for now though. As mentioned, feel free to check out Weyland-Yutani terrain. Links down in the video description if you want to take a look at their competitive terrain set range. There's the code Auspex5 for 5% off any purchase. Otherwise, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming with new ones out each day. If you have been enjoying the videos on the channel, Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well if you'd like to help support and keep them coming. That'll be links below also. There's a few advantages to being a Patreon member. Seeing certain videos early from time to time, occasional votes as to what comes next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways. If any of that sounds interesting or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.